They tell you Babylon had gardens that hung in the air, green terraces suspended over the desert like a miracle. But the clay tablets are silent. Not one Babylonian word, not one royal boast, and yet the Greeks swore they saw it. Walls dripping with waterfalls, palms thrusting skyward, an oasis clawed from dust by a king who bent nature itself. Nebuchadnezzar's name is burned into the tale, building for a homesick queen from the mountains, but his inscriptions, meticulous in their pride, list temples, palaces, gates. Not a single vine. The wonder is absent where it should roar the loudest. So where does the lie begin? Or was it no lie at all? In Nineveh, far to the north, another king, Sennacherib, carved into stone his triumph. An engineered mountain of gardens, rivers forced through aqueducts of stone, water dragged against gravity by machines no one dared believe possible. His words speak like prophecy. A wonder for all people. Was Babylon's marvel a mirage? An empire's reputation stolen from its rival? Twisted by Greek tongues until truth bled into legend? The hanging gardens shimmer on the edge of history. Half-built, half-dreamed. A phantom rising from dust and smoke, daring you to decide if they ever lived at all. The hanging gardens of Babylon were said to rise against the scorched plain like a miracle of stone and water. An impossible creation that would forever echo through history as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The ancients spoke of them with awe, tier upon tier of terraces layered with green, a cascade of plants suspended above the earth, an oasis against the desert sky. Their descriptions left the image of a structure not just magnificent but unnatural, as though human hands had forced the laws of the world to bend. Yet the first question that confronts the historian is as sharp as it is unsettling. Why does Babylon itself remain silent? The earliest accounts that survive come not from the Babylonians but from outsiders, Greek and later Roman writers who carried the tale centuries after the gardens supposedly stood. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, crafted one of the earliest Greek narratives about Babylon. He described the city in lavish terms, its walls so broad chariots could ride upon them, its gates of bronze, its rivers and temples, but in all his detail, he never once mentioned the gardens. This absence is as loud as any claim. If such a marvel existed in his time, or was remembered from earlier, why would the father of history omit it? His silence sets the tone for the mystery. It is later voices that breathe life into the wonder. Strabo, the Greek geographer of the 1st century BCE, records the gardens in his Geographica, writing of terraces rising one upon another like a theater, planted with every kind of tree. He describes massive stone pillars, arched foundations, and an irrigation system that lifted water from the Euphrates by means unknown. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE as well, paints an even more elaborate vision. He claims the gardens were built on a vaulted stone base, layered with reeds, asphalt, and bricks, topped with slabs of lead to hold back the moisture, soil laid deep enough for great trees to root. To his readers, it was as if a mountain of vegetation had been raised by sheer force of will in the flat land of Babylon. Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian of the 1st century CE, echoes similar details when recounting the campaigns of Alexander the Great. By then, the gardens were part of the legend that shaped Western understanding of Mesopotamia. He describes Nebuchadnezzar's love for his Median wife, Amytis, and the tale that he built the gardens to ease her longing for the mountains of her homeland. The story was irresistible to later ages. A king's devotion embodied in stone and water, an empire's wealth turned into an artificial paradise. Yet it is precisely this tale, so vivid and repeated, that raises suspicion. No Babylonian inscription mentions Amytis. No royal proclamation celebrates such a feat, and Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE, was not shy about immortalizing his projects in writing. His cuneiform inscriptions, preserved on clay tablets and stone cylinders, detail the construction of temples, the restoration of Babylon's great walls, and the raising of the colossal ziggurat et Menanke. But of a hanging garden there is nothing. The contradiction is suffocating. On one side, Greek and Roman writers spanning centuries describe the gardens as if they were real, each adding layers of detail, terraces, irrigation systems, exotic plants drawn from far-off lands. on the other, the very civilization that supposedly built them leaves no trace. Archaeologists working at Babylon since the 19th century, sifting through the ruins left by Nebuchadnezzar's grand projects, have uncovered palace foundations, fortifications, and ceremonial streets. They have identified the famed Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in Berlin, and remnants of water channels that served the city. But nothing has surfaced that unmistakably matches the descriptions of the gardens. Still, the accounts cannot be dismissed as invention without consequence. Diodorus claimed the terraces rose to a height of 50 cubits, around 75 feet, with each level broad enough to sustain whole trees. Strabo wrote of machines, hidden from sight, that raised water continuously from the river below, an engineering feat centuries ahead of its time. To Greek and Roman audiences, these details carried weight. They were not casual fables, but precise descriptions of mechanisms and architecture. The ancients understood that Mesopotamian engineers commanded irrigation on a vast scale, harnessing the Euphrates and Tigris to sustain agriculture across barren lands. To believe that they could extend this mastery into a monumental garden was not beyond reason. The technical challenge was staggering. For such terraces to sustain heavy soil and mature trees, foundations of stone would have been essential. Yet Babylon lay in the alluvial plain, where stone was scarce. The descriptions of bitumen and lead layers suggest an attempt to prevent water from seeping through the structure. And then there is the problem of lifting water. The Euphrates flowed beside the city, but raising water to such heights required continuous effort. Later interpretations suggested the use of a chain pump or screw-like mechanism, perhaps predating Archimedes. These speculations do not prove the gardens existed, but they reveal how the legend became anchored in plausibility. What is undeniable is that the Hanging Gardens, whether myth or reality, became fixed as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Compiled by Greek writers beginning in the 3rd century BCE, the list enshrined monuments that represented the might and ingenuity of human civilization. The gardens stood alongside the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. 6 of these wonders left material traces. Only the Hanging Gardens remain uncertain, their place secured by words rather than stones. And so the story continues to tighten like a noose. Ancient testimony insists they stood. Babylonian silence insists otherwise. Archaeology has yet to produce proof, but the legend refuses to vanish. Every account adds to the weight of the paradox. Every silence makes the absence louder. The Hanging Gardens endure, suspended between history and myth, their image pressed into the human imagination with such force that even the ruins of Babylon cannot erase them. By the late 7th century BCE, Babylon had risen from the shadows of conquest to become the beating heart of Mesopotamia, a city-state reborn under the power of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. When Nabopolassar seized independence from the crumbling Assyrian Empire in 626 BCE, Babylon transformed from a city occupied and suppressed into the capital of a new dynasty. His reign marked the beginning of a short but dazzling revival of Babylonian might, a period that reached its zenith under his son, Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne in 605 BCE, inheriting a kingdom already expanding, but it was under his command that Babylon turned into a city of impossible grandeur. His reign lasted until 562 BCE, more than 4 decades in which he reshaped the capital into a display of power meant to rival every city of the ancient Near East. His military campaigns reached as far as Judah, Tyre, and Egypt, securing wealth that poured back into Babylon. The spoils of conquest, resources, tribute, labor, were converted into construction on a scale so vast that his name is etched into bricks across Mesopotamia. The Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar built was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Its walls stretched outward in layers of fortification, with some sources claiming they reached heights of over 40 meters, though archaeology tempers these figures while still confirming their monumental scale. They were not just barriers of defense but symbols of prestige, built with sun-dried and kiln-fired bricks stamped with the king's inscriptions. At the heart of this fortified expanse stood the Ishtar Gate, a triumph of architecture and symbolism completed around 575 BCE. Constructed of glazed blue bricks, its surface shimmered with reliefs of striding lions, dragons, and bulls, sacred animals tied to Babylonian gods such as Ishtar, Marduk, and Adad. The gate was not merely an entrance but a statement, a portal into a city conceived as the earthly reflection of divine order. Inside the walls rose the ziggurat Etemenanke, a colossal structure dedicated to Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon. Etemenanke, meaning house of the foundation of heaven and earth, is believed by many scholars to be the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel. Rising in stepped tiers of mud brick, it stretched toward the sky with an estimated original height of around 90 meters, a staggering feat of engineering for its time. Around it, the city unfolded in ceremonial streets, palaces, and temple complexes, a design that fused religious devotion with imperial might. The sheer concentration of monumental construction during Nebuchadnezzar's reign projected Babylon as the unrivaled center of Mesopotamian civilization. The political weight of the city was as striking as its architecture. Babylon controlled key trade routes linking the Persian Gulf with the Mediterranean, funneling goods across Mesopotamia. Copper, tin, spices, timber, textiles. It was a meeting ground for cultures, merchants, and diplomats. Its scribes continued traditions of cuneiform record-keeping that stretched back nearly 2 millennia. Its scholars maintained astronomical observations and mathematical systems that would influence Greek science centuries later. To stand in Babylon during its prime was to witness the concentration of centuries of Mesopotamian achievement under one dynasty's rule. It was within this climate of prosperity and ambition that the story of the Hanging Gardens became attached to Nebuchadnezzar. Later accounts claim the king built the gardens as a gesture of devotion to his Median wife, Amytis, daughter of a northern ally. The marriage had been a strategic bond between the Babylonians and the Medes, cementing ties in a volatile landscape of shifting powers. But the legend insists it was not politics alone that defined the union. Amytis, accustomed to the mountains and greenery of her homeland, was said to have grown weary of Babylon's flat, arid plain. To ease her longing, Nebuchadnezzar supposedly commanded the construction of a terraced mountain in the heart of the city, its slopes overflowing with trees, flowers, and running water. The story is alluring. A king with immense resources, a queen yearning for the lost landscapes of her youth, an empire with the engineering skill to attempt the impossible. The narrative binds politics, romance, and technology into a single tale, perfectly suited to echo across the centuries. Yet what lends the story power also marks it with doubt. Nowhere in Babylonian records is Amytis named. No royal inscription, though Nebuchadnezzar left many, makes reference to such a project. The accounts that connect her with the gardens come only from Greek and later Roman writers, centuries removed from the time of their supposed construction. Still, the image persisted, carried forward by those outside Babylon who saw in the story a reflection of the city's scale and splendor. Babylon itself had become legendary even in antiquity. Herodotus, when writing in the 5th century BCE, described it as a metropolis of almost impossible size, with streets intersecting at right angles, canals cutting through neighborhoods, and temples rising above the landscape. Later visitors, though influenced by hearsay as much as by sight, reinforced the idea of Babylon as a place of wonders, a city where kings reshaped the world to their design. The tale of the gardens fit seamlessly into this narrative. The political importance of Nebuchadnezzar's reign magnified the power of such legends. His campaigns reshaped the Near East. He captured Jerusalem in 597 BCE and again in 587 BCE, initiating the Babylonian exile that became central to Jewish memory and biblical history. He subdued Tyre after a 13-year siege, demonstrating both military persistence and the immense logistical capacity of his state. These actions reverberated beyond Babylon's borders, creating an image of the king not only as a conqueror but as a ruler who remade landscapes, both human and physical. To attribute the Hanging Gardens to him was not merely believable. It was consistent with the scale of his ambitions. Archaeology confirms the monumental scope of his projects within Babylon itself. Excavations led by Robert Coldway in the late 19th and early 20th centuries uncovered sections of the city's foundations, palaces, and defensive walls. His team reconstructed the Ishtar Gate from thousands of glazed bricks, now standing in Berlin's Pergamon Museum, a physical testament to Nebuchadnezzar's vision. They found traces of vaulted chambers and thick foundations that some suggested could have supported a massive elevated structure. Yet these remain fragments, and none conclusively align with the gardens as described in Greek texts. The ambiguity has only deepened the allure. In its prime, Babylon embodied the convergence of power, architecture, and myth. Nebuchadnezzar II transformed it into the capital of an empire that briefly eclipsed every rival. A city where the gods were honored with colossal monuments and kings carved their authority into brick and stone. Against this backdrop, the tale of the Hanging Gardens, whether historical or imagined, took root. It was not only a reflection of personal devotion to a Median queen, but also a narrative that embodied the scale of the city itself, a wonder befitting the empire's greatest king. The silence of the tablets remains, but so does the weight of the legend, tied forever to the golden age of Babylon. The Hanging Gardens were not only a marvel of beauty in ancient accounts, they were a riddle of engineering, a claim that strained the boundaries of what Mesopotamian technology could achieve. To suspend a mountain of greenery above the desert plain meant bending water, stone, and soil into submission. It meant holding weight beyond the limits of ordinary building practice, while forcing rivers upward against gravity in a land where summer temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius and rainfall was rare. The gardens, if they existed, required machinery and construction techniques at the very limits of what was possible in the 6th century BCE. Greek and Roman authors gave fragments of description that fuel the problem. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, described terraces rising one above another, built like the seating of a theater. Diodorus Siculus, at roughly the same time, claimed the terraces rested on massive stone vaults, each surface sealed with asphalt, reeds, and lead sheets to prevent seepage. Over this artificial mountain, deep soil was piled, strong enough to anchor trees. Quintus Curtius Rufus added the detail of water lifted by concealed machines, drawing from the Euphrates and pouring life into the hanging paradise. Every sentence of these ancient writers suggests solutions to problems that would have been monumental in scale. The first and most pressing challenge was water. Babylon's wealth lay in its proximity to the Euphrates, but its climate was unforgiving. Irrigation defined Mesopotamian civilization for millennia, with canals stretching across the alluvial plain to sustain agriculture. Yet irrigation canals flowed horizontally, delivering water by gravity. The Hanging Gardens demanded something different: the continuous raising of water to heights that could exceed 20 meters or more. The device most often linked with such a task is the Archimedes screw, a spiral mechanism housed within a cylinder, capable of lifting water as it turned. But Archimedes himself lived centuries later, in the 3rd century BCE, far after Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Could the Babylonians have used an earlier form of such a device, or an entirely different system? Chain pumps provide another possibility. These consisted of buckets attached to a looped chain, drawn upward by a wheel, endlessly carrying water from river to terrace. Ancient depictions from later Greek and Roman contexts show their use, but the principle itself is simple enough to have existed earlier. Sennacherib of Assyria, in inscriptions dating to the early 7th century BCE, boasted of inventing a water-raising device to feed gardens in Nineveh. His texts describe bronze and iron mechanisms, a new invention never before seen, that carried water to his palace. If such technology was in circulation in Mesopotamia a century before Nebuchadnezzar, the engineering foundation for the Hanging Gardens becomes more plausible. The second challenge was weight. A terrace holding deep soil capable of sustaining mature trees would bear thousands of tons of load. Mud brick, the common building material of Mesopotamia, could not sustain such pressure without reinforcement. Stone, far rarer in Babylon than in Assyria, would have been essential. Diodorus' account of vaulted stone foundations has therefore attracted serious attention. Vaulting distributed weight, allowing heavy structures to span large areas. Archaeological excavations at Babylon in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by Robert Coldway revealed vaulted substructures near the southern palace complex. Some interpreted these as possible foundations for the gardens, though the evidence remains inconclusive. The waterproofing described by ancient writers also speaks to real Mesopotamian techniques. Layers of bitumen were used for centuries in canal and reservoir construction to prevent leakage. The addition of lead sheets, if accurate, would have been extraordinary but not impossible. The Neo-Babylonian state had access to metals through trade and conquest. Such measures indicate that the ancients conceived of the gardens not merely as ornament but as infrastructure, a living machine of soil, stone, and hydraulics. The archaeological record, however, resists certainty. The remains at Babylon include vast palace foundations, fortifications, temples, and ceremonial avenues. Coldway identified a massive vaulted structure northwest of the southern palace, with thick walls and chambers that he speculated might have supported the gardens. But no direct inscriptions, no carvings, no explicit Babylonian record ties the structure to such a project. Some scholars argue it was merely part of the city's defensive or storage systems. Others suggest that centuries of flooding, rebuilding, and conquest erased the traces. Babylon suffered multiple destructions after Nebuchadnezzar's reign: Persian conquest in 539 BCE, Macedonian occupation under Alexander, gradual decline under the Seleucids, each leaving scars across the ruins. The climate itself adds to the puzzle. Mesopotamia's aridity meant that without constant irrigation, no elevated garden could survive. This was not a project that could stand unattended. It required laborers, engineers, and administrators dedicated to maintaining water supply and plant growth. Such a system would have been visible, noisy, and costly. It would have demanded an administrative structure equal to the empire itself. That no Babylonian document mentions this machinery or its upkeep is a silence that continues to trouble historians. The contradictions accumulate like stone upon stone. The Greek descriptions are precise, with architectural and mechanical details consistent with ancient engineering. The Babylonians were masters of irrigation, experts in hydraulic management, builders of colossal monuments. And yet their tablets say nothing. Their ruins yield no definitive proof. Archaeologists find vaults, channels, and foundations, but not the garden itself. The possibility remains that what the Greeks described was not Babylon's wonder at all but Assyria's. Sennacherib's gardens of Nineveh, supplied by aqueducts at Jerwin, powered by water-raising devices he himself claimed to have invented. Still, the question resists resolution. Could Babylon, at its height under Nebuchadnezzar II between 605 and 562 BCE, have possessed the will, the resources, and the technology to build the Hanging Gardens? The evidence hovers on the edge of plausibility. The irrigation methods existed in principle, the construction techniques were within reach, the political and cultural climate favored monumental displays. The vaults beneath Babylon's ruins whisper possibilities but remain mute. The wonder lingers in absence, defined not by what is found but by what has never been proven. The silence of Babylon itself is the most haunting clue of all. Thousands of cuneiform tablets survive from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, written in the wedge-shaped script of Akkadian, chronicling every corner of his vast building program. They are precise, proud, and unflinching. They boast of temples restored, palaces razed, walls rebuilt. They list materials, describe dimensions, honor the gods to whom each monument was dedicated. Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, was no humble king. He recorded his works in meticulous detail to ensure his name endured. Yet in this immense archive, spanning decades of rule, there is no mention of a hanging garden. Not a line, not a phrase, not even the faintest reference to a project that later writers declared one of the greatest wonders of the world. This silence is not trivial. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions describe the reconstruction of the Great Ziggurat at Eminenki, the raising of the Ishtar Gate, the extension of defensive walls that encircled the city, and the creation of new palatial complexes. He writes of waterworks, of canals redirected, of streets repaved in baked brick. If he had created a garden suspended on terraces, irrigated with machines that defied gravity, a project requiring massive labor and constant maintenance, would it not have been recorded with the same pride? The Babylonians chronicled less significant undertakings than this supposed wonder. Their omission is a wound in the narrative, a void that cannot be ignored. Against this silence stand the voices of outsiders. Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BCE, Strabo in the same era, and Quintus Curtius Rufus a century later all describe the gardens as if they had been real. Even earlier, Ctesias of Cnidus in the 5th century BCE mentioned them, though his reputation among historians is tainted by exaggeration and hearsay. None of these writers lived in Babylon during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. They wrote centuries later, often relying on sources now lost, blending memory, myth, and second-hand accounts. Their works were shaped by the Greek encounter with the East, by the need to describe Babylon not merely as a rival city but as a place of marvels and excess, fitting into a worldview that saw the Orient as both wondrous and alien. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, complicates the matter further. He provided the most famous early Greek description of Babylon: its massive walls, its river-crossing bridge, its temples dedicated to Marduk. He offered pages of detail on the city's scale and layout, yet he never once mentioned the gardens. If they were a true and celebrated monument of Babylon, standing in the heart of the city, could Herodotus have failed to record them? His omission mirrors the Babylonian silence and undermines the claims that came later. And yet, by the time of Strabo and Diodorus, the gardens were already accepted as fact. This raises the unsettling question of invention. Were the Hanging Gardens a creation of Greek writers, a literary construction designed to complete the image of Babylon as a place of impossible wonders? The 7 wonders of the ancient world were themselves a Greek creation, a list compiled between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, intended to celebrate the marvels known to Hellenistic travelers. Only one, the Great Pyramid of Giza, predated Greek civilization. The others were monuments that could be tied to Greek cultural influence or contacts. In this list, Babylon was given its place through the gardens, whether they existed or not. To the Greek mind, Babylon could not be the greatest city of the East without a wonder to match its reputation. The mechanics of transmission are crucial. By the time Greeks wrote about Babylon in detail, the city had already suffered conquest and decline. Cyrus the Great captured it in 539 BCE, integrating it into the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great marched into Babylon in 331 BCE, treating it as a prize of conquest, and died there in 323 BCE. What the Greeks knew of Babylon came through Persian administration, through guides, through oral accounts handed down by locals, and through their own expectations of what an Eastern capital should contain. It is entirely possible that descriptions of Assyrian gardens in Nineveh, documented by Sennacherib's inscriptions, were transferred by error or design to Babylon. The confusion between the two cities, both great capitals, both lying along Mesopotamian rivers, may have produced a distorted memory that crystallized in Greek texts. Babylonian texts themselves are striking for their precision. Administrative documents record the rations given to temple staff, the allotment of supplies for workers, the calculations of astronomers mapping the stars. Nebuchadnezzar's building inscriptions praise the gods and name every structure he raised. The absence of a hanging garden in this meticulous body of evidence is not a gap caused by chance survival. Tens of thousands of tablets exist, covering the king's reign. They paint a detailed portrait of the city and its ruler. To argue that the gardens were built yet left unrecorded requires stretching credibility to its breaking point. The Babylonians wrote about their canals and orchards, their gates and fortresses. They did not ignore monumental works of pride. Yet the Greek accounts persist with stubborn detail. Strabo and Diodorus did not describe vague wonders. They gave structural features, vaults, terraces, irrigation methods, that align with Mesopotamian engineering practices. Their descriptions were not fantasy in the sense of impossibility. They were specific enough to be plausible, yet distant enough from the source to be corrupted. This tension is what makes the gardens so haunting. The sense that something real lies behind the words, but that it may not have been Babylon's achievement at all. The silence of Babylon and the insistence of Greece form a clash at the heart of the wonder. On one side, cuneiform tablets, dense, precise, undeniable, stand as witnesses to what was actually built. On the other, Greek prose, colorful, authoritative, widely read, crafted the image that endured. Between them lies the void, the absence of confirmation, the possibility that the Hanging Gardens existed only as an echo of another city, another time, transformed into legend. The silence is not passive. It is active, suffocating, a refusal of Babylon to claim the marvel others insisted it had. The tablets remain mute, the ruins unyielding. Yet the story survives, insistent, unbroken, written not in clay but in the imagination of those who could not let Babylon stand without a wonder worthy of its name. The trail that leads away from Babylon and into Nineveh begins with a single crack in the accepted story: the silence of Nebuchadnezzar's records. That silence forced scholars to ask whether the Greeks had attributed the Hanging Gardens to the wrong king, the wrong city, the wrong empire. Among those who followed this line was Dr. Stephanie Dalley of Oxford University, whose decades of research reshaped the debate by turning the focus northward, to the Assyrian capital of Nineveh and its most ambitious ruler, Sennacherib. Her argument rested not on speculation but on inscriptions, aqueducts, and engineering that could be touched, measured, and read. Sennacherib reigned from 704 to 681 BCE, nearly a century before Nebuchadnezzar II. His kingdom, the Assyrian Empire, stretched across Mesopotamia, ruling with military ferocity and administrative reach. Yet Sennacherib was more than a conqueror. In the texts he commissioned to commemorate his achievements, he called his palace at Nineveh a palace without rival, and described gardens that were not metaphors but constructions. He wrote of a marvel built for the delight of his subjects, a place sustained by water systems so advanced they astonished even modern engineers. In one inscription, he declared it to be a wonder for all people, a phrase echoing the language later Greek writers would attach to Babylon's Hanging Gardens. The engineering that underpins Sennacherib's project is undeniable. His inscriptions detail the construction of aqueducts and canals to carry water from distant mountains to Nineveh, a city situated on the east bank of the Tigris River. At Jerwin, around 40 kilometers from Nineveh, archaeologists uncovered one of the most remarkable hydraulic structures of the ancient Near East, a massive stone aqueduct built in the early 7th century BCE. Inscribed blocks from the site explicitly state that Sennacherib ordered the construction of this system to bring water to Nineveh. The aqueduct was built from millions of dressed stones, bound with iron clamps, carrying a canal over valleys to feed the city. This was no ordinary watercourse. It was an imperial project designed to sustain monumental gardens and supply an expanding capital. The scale of Sennacherib's water network is staggering. His texts describe cutting canals through hills, diverting entire rivers, and employing mechanical devices to raise water into elevated terraces. He even claimed to have invented a new kind of screw to lift water, centuries before Archimedes' name would be attached to such a device. Whether this was truly a screw pump or another form of water-raising machine, the evidence shows that Assyria was experimenting with hydraulic technology far in advance of its time. These devices, powered by human or animal labor, could have supported precisely the kind of elevated gardens the Greeks later described. The palace itself contained vast courtyards and terraces, some of which were decorated with carved reliefs depicting trees, vines, and flowing water. These images were not mere ornament. They reflected the gardens that Sennacherib had constructed, fed by the aqueducts and mechanical pumps. Unlike Babylon, where archaeology has yielded no definitive evidence of a garden, Nineveh preserves the infrastructure that could have sustained one. The aqueduct at Jerwin, the canals cut through rock, the inscribed boasts of the king himself. Together they form a body of evidence that aligns with the ancient descriptions. This evidence raises a sharp question. Could Greek and Roman writers have confused Babylon with Nineveh? The two cities were linked in the Greek imagination. By the time writers like Strabo and Diodorus recorded the wonder, Assyria had long since fallen. Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes sacked the city, tearing down the walls and burning the palaces. By the Hellenistic era, when the Seven Wonders list took shape, Nineveh was little more than a memory, its ruins swallowed by the landscape. Babylon, by contrast, remained a recognizable name, a city conquered by Cyrus, entered by Alexander, remembered in biblical tradition. To assign the gardens to Babylon was perhaps an error of memory, a shifting of the wonder from a forgotten city to a famous one. Greek reliance on second-hand reports magnified the possibility of such confusion. Few Greeks ever visited Nineveh. Fewer still left descriptions of it. By the time Alexander reached Mesopotamia, Nineveh had been in ruins for nearly 3 centuries. Babylon, in contrast, was alive in memory and in ruins that still inspired awe. It was easier for storytellers to place the Hanging Gardens in the city known across the Mediterranean than in the one already lost to time. The names of Assyria and Babylon blurred together in Greek accounts, as did their kings and monuments. The testimony of Sennacherib's inscriptions remains sharp, however. He boasted not in vague terms but in explicit engineering language. He described canals cut through mountains with iron tools, sluices to control flow, and machines that raised water into terraces. His gardens were stocked with trees transplanted from distant lands, made possible by the irrigation he had devised. Reliefs carved on the palace walls show water channels, aqueducts, and carefully tended trees, visual proof that aligns with his words. These are not echoes of hearsay. They are the voice of the king himself, written in Akkadian on stone. Archaeology at Nineveh confirms the scale of these works. Excavations at Kuyunjik, the mound that covers much of ancient Nineveh, revealed palace foundations and fragments of inscriptions that match Sennacherib's boasts. The Jerwin Aqueduct, with its inscribed blocks, is tangible proof of the water network he designed. The evidence of Assyrian hydraulic engineering is among the most advanced of the ancient world, demonstrating both technical sophistication and imperial ambition. It is this body of evidence that led Daly and others to argue that the Hanging Gardens were not a mirage but a misplaced memory. Their true home not Babylon but Nineveh. The theory does not erase the Greek accounts. It reframes them. When Strabo spoke of terraces, when Diodorus described vaulted foundations and water-lifting machines, when later writers told of a wonder sustained by advanced irrigation, their words match Nineveh more closely than Babylon. The silence of Babylon's records is mirrored by the abundance of Assyrian inscriptions. The absence of archaeological proof in Babylon is balanced by the physical remains of aqueducts and canals in Assyria. The contradiction dissolves not by denying the gardens but by relocating them, shifting the wonder from Nebuchadnezzar to Sennacherib, from the Euphrates to the Tigris, from Babylon's plain to Nineveh's terraces. The confusion of Greek writers may have been inevitable. To them, Mesopotamia was a vast, distant land where names blurred and dynasties overlapped. Babylon became the symbol of Eastern grandeur, the canvas upon which all marvels were painted. Nineveh, annihilated and forgotten, could not hold its place in their imagination. Yet the stones at Jerwin, the words carved by Sennacherib, and the scale of Assyrian water systems stand as enduring witnesses. They point not to a wonder lost in fiction, but to one shifted in memory, preserved imperfectly by writers who never walked the Assyrian aqueducts or saw the water rise into terraces sustained by machines older than Archimedes himself. The Hanging Gardens endure not because archaeology confirms them, but because the human imagination refused to let them go. Their fame was secured long before modern scholars demanded evidence. In the ancient world, what mattered was not whether they could be touched or measured, but that they existed in the words of those who carried stories across empires. Their power lay in narrative. Greek historians were central in giving the gardens their immortality. By the 3rd century BCE, when writers such as Philo of Byzantium began shaping lists of marvels into what later became the 7 wonders of the world, the Mediterranean mind was already attuned to tales of the East. Babylon symbolized a land of immeasurable wealth, massive walls, and monarchs whose power seemed beyond human limits. To place a garden of impossible scale within Babylon fitted perfectly into this worldview. The 7 Wonders list was not a catalog of proven monuments but a literary construct, a way of arranging marvels into an imagined order of greatness. What mattered was not proof but effect. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, had already cemented Babylon's image as a city of extremes. His descriptions of its walls, gates, and temples were filled with awe, even when accuracy faltered. Later authors like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, carried forward stories of the Hanging Gardens with vivid detail. Terraces stacked high like mountains, water raised by ingenious machines, shade cast by trees that did not belong in the Mesopotamian plain. Yet none of these writers claimed to have seen the gardens themselves. Their accounts were built from layers of retelling, blending hearsay, memory, an interpretation into a spectacle meant to astonish. The Seven Wonders list, though fluid in its earliest versions, was standardized in the Hellenistic era. The Hanging Gardens, placed among the pyramids of Giza, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and the statue of Zeus at Olympia, stood out precisely because they were elusive. Unlike the pyramids, they left no enduring stone skeleton. Unlike the Temple of Artemis, burned and rebuilt, they left no foundation stones traced by later archaeologists. Their absence made them pliable in the hands of storytellers, adaptable to the needs of different cultures. The Greeks needed an Eastern wonder to balance their list, and Babylon, remembered for its grandeur, became the stage. The role of cultural storytelling in shaping the garden's fame cannot be overstated. In Mesopotamian tradition, rulers often created gardens as symbols of divine favor, imitations of paradise, or displays of wealth. Kings transplanted exotic trees, channeled rivers, and carved irrigation systems into their cities. These were real acts of kingship. Yet when transmitted through the filter of Greek narrative, they became something more than royal projects. They became emblems of the miraculous. A Greek audience, accustomed to myth and epic, did not distinguish between engineering and wonder. The two were fused. Misinterpretation thrived in this environment. When Greek writers heard of Sennacherib's irrigation works at Nineveh or Nebuchadnezzar's vast palaces at Babylon, the details could blur. A terrace described in one account could merge with a mechanical water-lifting device mentioned in another, and soon an entirely new marvel was imagined. To the Greeks, the East was a land of marvels, and the gardens became the ultimate embodiment of that idea. Their fame persisted not because of certainty, but because of ambiguity. The less tangible they were, the more space there was for imagination to expand. The Hanging Gardens were not alone in inhabiting this border between myth and reality. The Colossus of Rhodes, a bronze statue of the sun god Helios, was indeed constructed around 280 BCE, but its appearance was exaggerated by later accounts. Some claimed it best rode the harbor of Rhodes, an image that would have been structurally impossible. No ancient source described it in this way, yet by the medieval period, the Colossus was imagined as a giant spanning ships with open legs. Myth overpowered fact, leaving the monument more famous in fantasy than it had ever been in reality. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, another wonder, was real and attested, yet it too became shrouded in legendary embellishment. Ancient writers emphasized its scale and beauty, calling it greater than anything built by mortals, though archaeology shows it was rebuilt multiple times after fires and invasions. What was remembered was not the precise temple but the idea of an eternal masterpiece of architecture. The Hanging Gardens shared this fate, remembered more as symbol than structure. The blending of fact and imagination reveals the nature of the Seven Wonders list itself. It was never meant as a factual record but as a cultural statement, a selection of marvels that reflected the values of the Hellenistic world. Size, strangeness, and symbolic weight mattered more than proof. The Gardens of Babylon, whether standing in Babylon, Nineveh, or only in stories, fulfilled a role that none of the other wonders could. They embodied human conquest over nature, a vision of greenery raised above the desert by ingenuity and willpower. To a Greek audience, that was the ultimate miracle. Not simply stone carved into form, but life itself suspended above barren earth. The fame of the gardens outlived the empires that supposedly built them. By the Roman era, they were cited repeatedly as the pinnacle of Eastern luxury. Writers such as Quintus Curtius Rufus, recounting the campaigns of Alexander, included them as evidence of Babylon's greatness. Yet archaeology at Babylon never revealed their traces, and by the modern era, scholars faced a puzzle unmatched by any of the other wonders. A marvel celebrated for centuries, yet nowhere to be found in the soil. That paradox only deepened their allure. The gardens exist in a space where history and legend are inseparable. They are cited in ancient texts yet absent from Babylonian records. They are praised by Greek authors yet doubted by modern archaeology. They are remembered in the same breath as monuments whose stones still rise above the earth, yet they leave only questions in their wake. This tension between reality and myth gave them longevity. The certainty of the pyramids is undeniable, but their meaning has remained fixed. The Hanging Gardens, by contrast, live in uncertainty, and it is that uncertainty that has kept them alive. They became a mirror for the cultures that transmitted them. For the Greeks, a tale of wonder from the East. For the Romans, a symbol of conquered luxury. For later ages, a riddle of history. Their fame was not built on stone but on narrative, and narrative is harder to destroy than walls or palaces. This is why they endure, endlessly retold, standing between what was real and what was believed, a monument made not of mud brick or stone, but of memory itself. The Hanging Gardens did not vanish with Babylon's ruins. They were carried forward in ink, brushstrokes, and architectural visions, persisting not through stone, but through the human need to recreate what may never have existed. In the centuries after their supposed creation, they became more than an ancient marvel. They became a symbol, reshaped by every culture that retold the story. Painters of the Renaissance gave them physical form when no trace could be found. European artists of the 15th and 16th centuries filled canvases with tiered terraces rising above Mesopotamian plains, walls draped with vines, and fountains spraying arcs of water over imagined palaces. These were not archaeological reconstructions but projections of longing, built from fragments of ancient texts. For an age hungry for classical antiquity, the Hanging Gardens stood alongside the Colossus of Rhodes and the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus as icons of a vanished world. Artists such as Merton van Heemskerk in the 1570s produced engravings that placed the gardens in imagined landscapes, lush, ordered, and overflowing with greenery, where reality was secondary to awe. Literature carried them even further. Writers in the classical tradition had already embedded the gardens into the canon of world wonders. Later poets and historians repeated these accounts, cementing their place in cultural memory. By the Enlightenment, European travelers and scholars were convinced they had to search for them among Babylon's ruins, treating every mound of brick and every fragment of inscription as potential proof. The absence of evidence did not erase the gardens. It heightened the mystery. Their invisibility in the ground only magnified their visibility in the human imagination. Modern reconstructions transformed the gardens into architectural blueprints. Scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries, confronted with the silence of Babylonian cuneiform records, attempted to rebuild them on paper. Some envisioned massive stone terraces with vaulted arches beneath. Others described elaborate irrigation systems with water screws or chain pumps to lift water from the Euphrates. These reconstructions, though speculative, revealed more about the age that created them than about the gardens themselves. They were reflections of modern engineering pride, projecting back into antiquity the technical sophistication of industrial times. Each drawing, each model testified to the human refusal to let the gardens vanish into myth alone. The gardens came to embody humanity's ambition to master nature. Unlike the pyramids, which transformed stone into permanence, or the Colossus, which displayed the scale of bronze, the Hanging Gardens represented control over life itself. They spoke of taking rivers and forcing them upward, turning dry plains into fertile terraces, bending exotic trees to thrive in foreign soil. In every retelling, they symbolized abundance conjured out of barrenness. To later ages, they became not just a wonder of engineering but a metaphor for the human will to shape the environment against all limits. This symbolism resonated far beyond Babylon. The idea of an elevated paradise garden influenced traditions across regions and centuries. In the Persian world, royal gardens, known as paradisa, the root of the modern word paradise, were already central to kingship. These gardens, enclosed and carefully ordered, represented divine harmony. The Greek and Roman fascination with the Hanging Gardens blended with this Persian tradition, giving rise to a long cultural memory of earthly paradises cultivated by rulers. When later Islamic dynasties built their great gardens in Persia, Mesopotamia, and India, the echoes of this vision endured. The Mughal emperors of the 16th and 17th centuries created vast terrace gardens at places like Shalimar in Kashmir and the Taj Mahal in Agra, where water flowed in carefully engineered channels, bringing life to marble courtyards and orchards. These were not copies of the Hanging Gardens, yet the resonance was unmistakable. The same dream of a controlled Eden, an earthly imitation of paradise. The connection between gardens and heaven only deepened with time. Religious traditions across the Near East and Mediterranean carried images of lush, ordered gardens as symbols of divine reward. In Judeo-Christian texts, the Garden of Eden stood as the archetype of creation's perfection, a place where rivers flowed and every tree was pleasing to sight and taste. In Islamic tradition, paradise is described as a garden beneath which rivers flow, with shade, fruit, and beauty beyond comprehension. The Hanging Gardens, whether real or legendary, became part of this broader cultural fabric. The idea that paradise could be built, seen, and touched in earthly form, even if only for kings and queens. In modern times, the fascination remains unbroken. Archaeologists continue to debate whether the gardens were in Babylon at all, or whether they should be relocated in theory to Nineveh under Sennacherib. Scholars like Dr. Stephanie Daly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries argued that inscriptions describing vast gardens and aqueducts at Nineveh fit the classical accounts better than anything found at Babylon. This reinterpretation has reshaped museum displays, documentaries, and academic debates. The gardens' legacy lies not in certainty but in the continued hunger to locate them. Their identity shifts with each new discovery, yet the magnetism of the legend does not weaken. Popular culture carries the gardens into the present. They are reconstructed in films, novels, and digital media, often portrayed as the ultimate symbol of ancient grandeur. Their terraces appear in historical epics, animated works, and even video games, where they stand as shorthand for ancient power and mystery. This repetition keeps the memory alive, ensuring that the Hanging Gardens remain instantly recognizable even to those who cannot list the other wonders. Their endurance in cultural imagination outstrips any evidence that they were ever built. The gardens, more than any other wonder, reveal the way humanity builds monuments out of longing as much as out of stone. They represent not only ancient engineering but a perpetual desire for paradise, for mastery of environment, for a world where nature itself bends to human design. That is why artists, scholars, and rulers across time have reached back to them, shaping them anew for each age. Whether engraved by a Renaissance hand, reconstructed by a Victorian engineer, or modeled in 21st century computer graphics, the Hanging Gardens continue to grow, not in Mesopotamian soil, but in human imagination. They survive as a cultural legend, carried from Babylon to Greece, from Renaissance art to modern scholarship, a chain of retellings that stretches across 3 millennia. Their endurance does not depend on bricks or roots, but on the human refusal to let go of a wonder, even one that may never have stood. They remain suspended between existence and absence, a monument not only to a lost empire but to the timeless capacity of people to shape myth into memory and memory into history.